Welcome to the Sober by Design podcast, where we explore the many pathways to recovery and a better life through conversations with a wide array of guests. Whether you're sober curious, in recovery, or simply looking to improve your mental health and well-being, this podcast will have something for you. Each week, we sit down with inspiring guests from all walks of life who share their personal stories of struggle and triumph, offering valuable insights and practical advice on how to design a life worth living. From addiction and mental health to spirituality and creativity, we cover a wide range of topics that are relevant to anyone seeking to live a more fulfilling and authentic life. So join us on this journey of discovery, growth, and transformation, and start designing a new life. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Sober by Design podcast. It's been a couple weeks since I have actually been on the mic, so I might be a little rusty, and I am nursing a cold, so bear with my voice and any sips of tea I might take. Tonight, I have a guest, maybe a little bit different than our normal, but super interesting, and I'm really excited to talk with Thomas Wilson, who is the founder of R&amp Creative Advocacy and Storytelling LLC. Thomas is also a storyteller, a game master, and a community advocate out in Colorado. So welcome to the podcast, Thomas.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, really excited to have you. You know, your bio stuck out to me. Typically on the show, we do, center a lot of our discussions around substance issues, how people found recovery. But when, I found you, I think you had reached out to me, your bio resonated with me. There was a couple little points in there that, sparked my interest because of my one son, my younger son, Desmond. And I just wanted to talk more to you and, what you're doing for your community out in Colorado and just with your business. So that's why we're here tonight. But as always, I like to start with just asking my guests a little bit about how they grew up, where they grew up, and kind of what put them on their path in life. So if you can give us a little background, as much as you're willing to share, that would be great.
Definitely. So, yeah, I was a young kid. I always like to start off with the mentality that when I was real young, in my early days in school, I definitely had my struggles, but I was one of those kids that in my first few grades, I was considered a prodigy. I was excelling in school, and I really had a lot of potential, is what my teacher said. But at a certain point in my life, I actually grew up around several influences who had their own substance abuse issues, who had their own mental health issues, and they did not regularly treat themselves. So at a point in my life when I suffered a significant loss, my first real introduction into knowing that I had some intense mental health needs were right at that point when I lost someone very near and dear to me. But I always like to tell people as well, for that student who many of my teachers said was I was the best, I was going to go on to do great things in my life, that actually changed substantially very quickly. It became the mentality of that I was a problem, that I was a mistake, is what some teachers told me. I even had teachers who told me that I was going to end up in jail because I had temper issues. And I spent a lot of my life in that system, and I'm getting feedback. Are you getting feedback?
No, I'm good on my end, Thomas.
Okay. But diving back into that, I was told that I was going to have problems. I was going to end up in jail. And throughout a lot of my life, that was my experience with a lot of institutions in the world. A lot of systems that were supposed to help me. I realized how broken they were. But speaking of sober by design, I also grew up with some very heavy mental, emotional, and traumatic experiences over top of me, including a very real mentality that if I were to ever drink or use substances, that I would end up in a really bad state very quickly. And so I spent a lot of my life hating them. And in all of those experiences, one of the things I kept learning more and more is that a lot of systems that are supposed to help youth are not set up to actually help them. They're based in what the people providing the care want versus necessarily what the youth actually need. And so it wasn't until I was in college, I spent a large chunk of my life in Manchester, New Hampshire, in the city. And I actually ended up in Colorado when I was 14. And I like to mark that as a point in my life where things started to change. I started to acknowledge my worth. I started to really put in work. And by the time I had graduated high school, I was the valedictorian of my class and the first high schooler from my school to actually graduate through a particular program. I went on to college to study writing. And not long after that, I started realizing how much I care for my community, started really focusing on being an advocate. And right around my late high school, college years is really when I started doing events through volunteer work. And now it's been a lifelong passion that I have over 14 years of professional experience in. I'm able to help establish programs that are designed to help youth and adults who are dealing with mental health and other needs. And I've become a very strong community advocate for a variety of things such as equity, employment, better school systems, and so much more, all rooted in the mentality of what I wanted to seek in life, um, that I didn't receive, that build programs to fight for things that I know youth need and youth tell me they need based on what they need. It's a very quick overview of the things I've been through, but I hope that helps to illustrate a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it does. So, just to step back for a minute, it sounds like you grew up in New Hampshire up until about the age of 14. Did I catch that part right?
You did.
Okay. And then the other thing in there was the loss. So, the loss was earlier than 14, is what I'm taking in. Is that
Yes,
correct?
it was.
Okay. So you had a period of time in New Hampshire where you're struggling in school. Something happened. You went from this student who showed a lot of promise and you were kind of, on one path. Obviously a traumatic event happens. Your world is rocked. And then you're in this school system in New Hampshire and they're not addressing the need that presented at that time. So they're not seeing you as this prodigy anymore. They're seeing you as a problem. Um, what precipitated the move from New Hampshire to Colorado?
I love that question. Part of it was my mother. My mother actually fought for me and worked very hard in order to make sure that I had all the needs that I wanted in life, everything to treat. And she got an opportunity to get a job with ARN, which is a massive nursing organization. But one of the biggest elements when I was at a point where I was really struggling in life, hated school, didn't necessarily want to exist anymore. We came out here, and there was a day when we were checking out Colorado that I was in the car with my mom. And for the first time in a really genuine way, I said, I like it out here. I'm happy out here. And my mom always marks that as the day that she knew we were going to move out here, because there was something in me innately that loved Colorado. And that job was a massive part of that. But the support systems and something special about Colorado was a major indicator.
Gotcha. So it was kind of a two-pronged thing. One, your mom ended up having this opportunity present itself, which is sort of, the universe working in a great way. And then you're out there as this 14-year-old who is seeing a place where you felt at home. And the two collided, and it sounds like it worked out really well for you. So at 14, I'm just going through, that's like freshman year of high school, maybe?
So I was in my last year of middle school when we moved out here.
Okay.
But I had entered high school not long after turning 15.
Okay. So that's a tricky time to move for a kid. I have two boys, and we, I always say like, okay, I got to move kind of either in between high school and middle school, or you kind of pick a time, right? Because it's one of those age groups where a move can really set a child back. For you, it seems like it was really, really well received. You ended up kind of settling into eighth grade and then skipping on to high school there, and became the valedictorian. Was it just that the support system at this school was better? What transpired to take you from this person who was maybe having this struggle to now somebody who's really found a groove at that age? Like how did that happen besides your mom? I know your mom was probably a huge part of it, but like what else is going on at that time for you to kind of propel you forward in your high school journey?
I should definitely state the first few years of high school and middle school were really rough. I had that traditional, like being new to an environment space, but I actually ended up in a high school that was devoted to people who are struggling in the regular school system. And while I had some really intense years, what I found in high school through this program was it was a much smaller class size for starters, and the mentality against having students compete against each other was very different. On top of that, the actual school size was substantially different. One thing that I always try to tell youth is that if you're in a massive school and you feel alone, that is understandable, especially when so many students go through this phase of feeling like they're just a face in a system. And for me, that was definitely the mentality that I was in when I was in middle school and high school and elementary school. So a big part of it was to transition the smaller size class sizes. I also had a variety of teachers who really fought for me, people who understood mental health care, who had been working for a number of years. And instead of pushing me to be something I wasn't, helped me to foster and really encourage and elaborate on who I wanted to be in life. And that school system really helped. I also ended up with a few mentors out here in Colorado who were really supportive and offered a lot of light in my life in a time that I needed it. And I should definitely say that like my life wasn't peachy keen immediately after that either, but it started offering supports that I really needed.
Okay. So you were able to kind of, well, it sounds like there was a couple of things going on. One, you ended up at a school that maybe was smaller and a little bit more dedicated to, people who were not able to I don't want to say fit in, but to sort of matriculate into a larger school, right? Like it was almost as if this school was set up to help people find a path in education that worked for them. Where a traditional public school, and this is I'm going through a little bit of this now with one of my kids. It's like the school is just like this is the system, fit in or it there's nothing else for you, right? Like that tends to
Mhm.
be a little bit more what I see in the traditional public school system. Is that kind of the difference between the two schools you were at?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I could see how
Um,
that would be helpful if you're a kid who's struggling, where you're just saying like, "Hey, I want something here. I don't like school because it makes me feel, off." And you just keep going back, and you're confronted with teachers who just want you to, you know, do the thing, go to class, be quiet, raise your hand, right? Like, and you're a kid, and you're sitting there, and you're saying, "I just want to do it just a slightly different, and I'll be okay." And there's no way to do that in a normal school day, in a quote unquote normal school. So it sounds like you found your spot, in time.
I definitely did. Part of the reason I am such an advocate for honoring youth needs around what they need is because a lot of the time when I said I needed, when I was in school, the adults in the system didn't believe that I knew what I was talking about.
Mm.
I also developed a very strong understanding as a kid who had temper issues due to my mental health and anxiety and depression. I learned myself and a lot of youth like me at that time wanted to be able to advocate for ourselves better. But the reality was, when we're in those states of intense emotion, it's so hard to be able to process the accurate way of how we want to communicate for ourselves. And
Sure.
because of that, those memories of wanting to say the right thing but becoming angry or upset and people getting mad at me, I learned, and as I've been in this field for a long time, I continue to learn that people aren't teaching kids how to process that in the way that they need. And so, one of my first steps when I work with youth who's in the school system is to try to help them to acknowledge that what they're feeling is valid and help them create a plan for how they want to advocate for themselves in the school system.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, one, you're a child, right? So it's not that easy for children to communicate in general. Two, there's like a power dynamic there that's just like, the teacher student power dynamic is just inherently, the student doesn't have the power. And then three, when you're mad or upset, you're not your best self. So I think it's great that you're going in and trying to figure out ways to help these kids tell their stories, because a lot of kids too, their parents aren't maybe knowing what to do, what to say, how to navigate systems. Maybe the child has parents that just don't care, unfortunately, to help them. So I think it's a huge thing that needs to start to happen more and more. If you don't speak up, it just your kid kind of gets swallowed up by the school. I'm seeing that more and more. And again, if you're just if you have a kid who's maybe just off center from what is normal in the school district, it takes a little bit of effort to write these things, and it takes time, but it takes somebody to speak up and advocate. So it's great that you're doing that. I did have a question. So you left high school and you went on to college. What did you go to college for exactly, Thomas?
So at the time, I wanted to get a degree in screenwriting.
Okay.
Um, but I ended up at a community college, which was wonderful for me. My counselor who helped me figure out what school to go to was very adamant about me making sure to consider going to a smaller school, um, which it was a wonderful decision. Um, but on top of that, instead of going for screenwriting, because my school was too new to that kind of program, I had a college professor who was also my mentor who said, go for something a little simpler. Our system is not set up to have a reputable program right now, which I very much appreciate to this day. So I actually ended up going for poetry. I've loved poetry ever since I was real little, and I heard Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, and it's actually something I'm really glad I went to because it's very unique, and I learned a lot from it.
Hmm. And after community, did you go on to another 4-year school, or did you take that associates and kind of go into the world at that point?
So I did not continue college. I was not a big fan of college
Okay.
when I got my degree, mostly because it just felt um, I was working at the time too, and it just a very stressful experience. I've never been a fan of tests. I get really bad test anxiety, and I got so many through college, it just felt overwhelming. But that being said, I've actually continued my education in a variety of ways. I'm a big advocate for people seeking training outside of the school system. I've been a trained peer specialist. I've been ACRE certified to help people find job work. I've attended numerous mental health trainings throughout the years, other trainings as well. And I really love that in today's day and age, that kind of education is valuable and accessible.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And, with online and, you can always find stuff in your community. People don't seek that stuff out and understand how it can help you progress in life. It's not just a, 4-year degree and that's the only option. There's so many avenues now that have opened up over the years. Completely different than, when I went into college back in 95. It seemed like there was like kind of one path. I think now it's so different. It's so varied. So it's great that you're taking advantage of those things. Um, so did you start when you left community college, did you start your business right away? Or was there a lag in there? And did you do other things? Because you said you were working. Were you working on your business, or were you doing some other avenue at that point?
So at that point, I was working in retail. I didn't open my business until late 2021. Um, but I have been doing events of this kind for employers for a long time now. Um, and that was, oh my gosh, I think I graduated when I was 22, and I had started doing events for various communities, I think by my senior year of high school, but it was, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, but I was working in retail at the time.
Okay. And when you say events, what do these events look like?
So when I first started out, I was working with an organization on, like, my very first experiences were working with a couple churches that had some new students who had autism. So I was helping develop like play events for those kids, as well as helping them figure out how to teach those young kids with autism, how to teach them in Sunday school and how to get them to participate in play events. Um, and I had done that for a few years, but it wasn't until, oh my gosh, I think I was 23 when I really started doing it professionally, where I was helping out with um, a organization, a day program, and I helped them run a variety of in-house events, from group writing activities to other things like that. And then at that point, those small little programs of events evolved into me working for a local organization called Developmental Pathways, where I would do care and respite events for families who had people with more significant needs in the mental health and neurodiverse community. And that has been about 10 years now that I've been doing a variety of things. I'd be happy to break it down, the events I'm doing now, but my work really started in some very humble beginnings.
Okay. Yeah, for me, I think and probably the listeners, like, a good place to start is, there's obviously you're doing events for different types of people, right? You brought up, children with autism, you brought up neurodivergent people. I know that you've brought on like sensory type events, and each one probably has its own things, but like it might be interesting to understand some of the differences between these diagnosis, because I think a lot of times people don't know that they are so different, and each one has its own challenges and its own interesting parts, and so for me, if you could just kind of maybe go through a little bit of like what something for somebody who is, neurodivergent might look like versus somebody who's, has sensory processing disorder. And if you can give a little background on that, that might be really kind of helpful for the audience.
Definitely. So, starting with autism, a lot of the things a lot of the events. So, I've done events called Stories Meant for Movement, that is designed to use active play to help young youth develop their storytelling slash self advocacy skills. I've done sensory friendly events for people who have sensory processing issues, where I make sure that the tone of my voice, you can probably hear a little bit of it now, the way in which I talk, the music, the space of the environment is all broken up. And a lot of my programs are designed to adhere to all of these people, but depending on the need, like autism, I make sure that I am breaking things down in a patient, kind, considering manner. I'm making sure that I'm honoring the way that they process information. On top of that, I'm making sure that I'm avoiding potential triggers, that I'm helping them figure out how to process how they may communicate in the way that they know how to. And I've carried that over to a wide variety of programs. But for those with sensory processing issues, try to make sure the lighting is as kind as possible. I make sure that the tone of my voice and the way that my body behavior works is very gentle, very kind. I work to smile a lot, because a lot of people don't always realize that a big part of things for a lot of people with sensory needs is it's not just noise level, it's not just the tone or music being played, it's not just the amount of people. I'm a big guy, so if I were to walk into a space with kiddos or adults that have trauma or sensory issues, and I were to be loud and really raise my voice, part of the detriment of that is I could be seen as a threat, like
Mm.
something that may trigger that need to run. So what I do is especially every time I'm running an event, I work to make sure I greet people. I'm kind. I give off a simple energy. And every time I say energy, I know there might be somebody who's rolling their eyes. But what I mean by that is really that my body language is kind, simple, that I work to make sure know they're heard by listening, acknowledging the first things they say. I work to make sure that the way in which I interact with families is respectful and kind. And for those of us with neurodiversity, when I'm running games like D&D or Dungeons and Dragons, one of the rules that I live by is just because someone doesn't understand doesn't mean it's their fault. So I'm always willing to repeat myself. I always make sure that I'm patient, kind, willing to take in input. If I'm doing stories like the Dungeons and Dragons, I'm willing to take in the ideas that people want to use in game. And a lot of these skills correlate for multiple communities, but another big one that I work with is also the vision impaired community. And when I'm telling stories for that community, I work to make sure that my tone and the words I use are deliberate so that people can visualize it in their mind. I'll make sure that they have tactile things that they can touch, so they get a better understanding of what they're experiencing. I always make sure that they know where I am and that I ask them before I touch them or before I move something, so they know that they have control over their space. And even for people that I've worked with who have physical limitations, a big thing for that, breaking that down, is also making sure that they know my space, making sure I communicate with them, but it's also making sure that I make them feel that they have the absolute power over their space where they are, where I make sure that I acknowledge them with respect. I give them opportunities that help them to feel their power in their space so they're not limited. They have as much control as they want.
Hmm.
And I never try to overcompensate by thinking that they aren't capable of doing something. I find a lot of people with physical limitations, and I realize some people might not like that terminology. I'm trying to be as respectful as possible.
Sure.
they have a lot of people with a variety of diagnoses. This is true. They have a lot of people who impose physical mindsets or restrictions, or if they say they have something, people will physically help them move. And that's another thing that I work very hard not to do, because if someone says they have something, I have to honor that. And again, these are a variety of topics that are very complex, and I'm simplifying them down. But I hope that helps to illustrate some of the more complexities of running these events.
Yeah, it does. And I think, when so I didn't know much about this world up until about 12 years ago. And really, I just kind of, you mentioned a lot of different things in there, right? So visually impaired people 100% get it, right? Like that is very clear to me to understand. And most people, I think, in the world can understand that, right? If you talked about, hearing impaired people, I think people would 100% understand that too. I think autism now has been so widely, um, brought out front in the media. There's television shows where there's characters who, are autistic, and, it's just something that's become commonplace in our society, at least. And then you go a little bit deeper, and then you now have sensory processing disorder or neurodivergent people. I think that's where, some folks get a little bit lost and they can't quite understand the difference, right? It's just sort of all lumped into one thing. But you are obviously honoring each one individually and understanding that each one has its own, nuance as you come into these events. And I think the more and more that people can learn about this, the better off we are as a society. Again, I had mentioned that like our younger son was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder at a pretty young age. He had if you had told me about it before the diagnosis, I don't know that I would have understood it, but I saw it. His was a physical hot and cold issue. Like he couldn't differentiate the temperatures. So when we would give him a bath, we would do, say, a lukewarm water, and he would scream out that we were burning him. We would do cold water, scream out that we were burning him. Like he just couldn't, his body was processing everything completely wrong. So it gets to that level for some of these folks, and it can range from, they are seeking to kind of, feel impact, and then to your point, like some people don't want to hear loud noises. Some people do. It's so varied, and I think just the more we can highlight some of this, the better. I myself am still learning about the neurodivergent people, and shame on me, but some of what I've learned about that is social media, which probably isn't the best place to learn anything for all my listeners. I'm sure there's some great accounts and everything, but just in general, I don't know that learning about these things on like TikTok is a great way. But what you're doing, I think, honors each group individually, Thomas, and that's great. So I just wanted to get through that a little bit. Do you work specifically with like not-for-profits, or do you go and work at like companies to help them understand, maybe their employees, or how far do you go with your business at this point?
So I have a very wide range. A lot of the work that I have done, I was not expecting to fully do, to be completely honest. I just found a need, and I knew that I had a capability. So I do a wide range from events to public speaking events to education for the community. I even help out with programs that work for equity in the workplace for the communities I work with. I've broken into consulting for organizations because they've reached out to me and I have the ability to help. Um, I have, especially because I do everything myself, the mindset that if I can do it, I can do my best to help the community. But all of those things are very complex. And to really simplify it down, So I've done so to refine this a bit. Everything I do is extremely wide range, but uh, but what I would say is the reason I do that is because I have that experience, I have that capacity to understand where things are. All of my work is built around that, and we don't have time for me to break down everything I
Mhm.
do. Um, but I like to say that everything that I do in the core is built around communication with the people I work with the organizations I work with. And yes, I've worked with nonprofits and charities. My business is for profit. Part of the reason I'm keeping it for profit is I really want my business to be an example of that for profit businesses can be ethical, can be compassionate, and the mindset that a lot of people have of for-profit healthcare organizations or event businesses can be a little schemy. um, I want to be a contradiction to that. I also don't like certain elements of how the United States has set up nonprofit work. So while I work with both organizations, I try to be the opposite of a lot of what people think of for both.
That's pretty interesting. I like it. I like that idea that, a for profit business can be ethical and do good work. And um, I think more people should think of that as they go about their day in their work. Um, a lot of times it's just profit over everything, and that's not a great mindset. So I love that idea that you've put forward, and it's a great sort of foundation to your business. I want to get a little bit off of this part, and just because you had told me a couple things that you wanted to be introed as, and storyteller and community advocate. So we've talked a little bit about those, and then the other one was game master. And I'm just going to be honest, I know nothing about this world. So I just kind of want to ask you, like you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, is game master specifically around Dungeons and Dragons, or are you doing more in that arena? And I just open it up to you to talk a little bit about it, and then I'll kind of ask questions as they come up, if that's okay.
Definitely. So Game Master can definitely tie into Dungeons and Dragons. It can also tie into other tabletop role-playing games, as well as role-playing games. My work, a good chunk of my work is around Dungeons and Dragons, and it's all focused on making sure that that person first and empathy-based mindset is carried in. I also keep it into the realm of sensory friendly as much as I can. But on top of that, I've done role playing games. I've done active play events around fantasy world building. I've done straight world building events for the community. Um, all of that is really tied into the idea that role playing games and tabletop role playing games are in their core designed around asking questions and developing ideas and having shared storytelling. I like to use game master more than dungeon master just because it's a little bit more of a ambiguous term that can be applied to a little bit more. But what I love about these games is they are so beautiful for helping people develop self advocacy, building peer relationships, developing math skills, problem solving, critical thought processing, real time decision making in the hands of the right person. I like to say I'm one of the right people, but in the core of it, it's because so much of it is open communication and having to handle situations in game. For people who don't know Dungeons and Dragons, and I can appreciate that, it can be an overwhelming thing to get into. The core of it is really centered around one person at the table leading the story, and then presenting scenarios where people roll dice and then they have to make decisions or fight in combat, like a Japanese role playing game or video games might have. And a lot of it's very real time decision making. And one of the other elements that I love about it is it's also a great opportunity for youth and teens and even some adults to kind of release their anger or frustration or anxiety and depression and have a moment of escapism where they can get away from the world, not have to deal with the stressors of real life, and kind of have a moment either saving the city, overthrowing the dictator, fighting a dragon, defeating a great evil, or even just being silly and fighting, each other in game and laughing and playing. There's a term that you didn't used to be as connected to therapy as it is now, which was D&D therapy, which is the mindset of just escaping into world, pretending to be someone else for a while, and feeling relief at the end of that. There's now a lot of people who are professional therapists who are moving into this. One thing that I always like to highlight, which was pointed out to me, is every game master should not feel like a therapist unless they're doing it with a particular mindset.
Yeah.
A very strong, this is why I'm doing it. I know some people who are game masters who don't want to do therapy work, who don't want to help people process skills, and that's okay. I always like to highlight that every game master or dungeon master should stay within the boundaries of what they're comfortable with. So if you're there and you're thinking maybe I should be doing this, but you're not comfortable with it, there's nothing wrong with that.
I'm sitting here listening and I'm thinking about so there's a couple of things I'm thinking about, and all of it is related to sort of connection with people. So first I'll say that my older son used to go to a game store and play Pokemon cards on Friday nights. So we would drop him off, he would play, and there was this very varied group of people. He was by far the youngest, and then everybody else ranged probably from 18 to the oldest person in the room was probably well into her 50s. But they got together every week, and it was a core group of people. They had a lot of fun, and there was a lot of connection going on. So I saw that experience of the tabletop type game. I know it's not the same. It is like it's a card-based game. But there were also other groups that would meet at the same store, and they would do other games. I'm not exactly sure what they were playing, but almost every night it seemed like there was some sort of community getting together there. We also live very close to a campground that on the weekends hosts different types of live action role-playing events. And every weekend the place is packed with people. I don't exactly know what they do, but they all get together, and they're different sorts of role-playing games that are going on in the woods, and they camp there and they stay, and they're there Friday night, Saturday, and then they leave sometime on Sunday. The one through line is that these people are getting together in person, talking, interacting with each other in real life, right? And I think it is the opposite of what is going on sometimes with some kids right now, where they're sitting at home and they're behind the screen all the time. And it's interesting to me because back in the 80s and probably 90s, D&D got like a bad rap for, there's a history to it, and I don't know it well enough to speak on it, so listeners can go examine it, but I know that there was a lot of sort of backlash against D&D. It was seen as a bad thing. Kids that were playing it were kind of, stereotyped as maybe, on the wrong side of religion, and it was just a bad connotation. But if I was to just look at it objectively right now from the outside, I would much rather see my kids playing in these environments where they're face to face with people, and they're creating actual social bonds, not just like a person on a screen or maybe a voice on a headset that's playing a video game with you, but you have no real interaction with that person sometimes. And I never really thought about it until now, but these are probably some of the last types of games and activities that kids have besides organized sports at this point where they get together in person. And they're not, and they're still looked at, I think, unfortunately, Thomas, I still think they're looked at as like a fringe activity, if I can be so blunt. Is that how you see it? Am I crazy to think that it's still looked at as like a fringe type thing?
I think there's a lot of pushback. As much as we are in today's society with people being like, I'm a nerd for this, I'm a nerd for this, I do think there's a lot of anger and hostility towards a lot of different activities. There was one thing I wanted to touch on, as you had mentioned, the difference between being on a screen and being on there in person. And I actually want to highlight, I run several online groups
Yes.
for Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't think this is necessarily what you're saying, but I do see a lot of pushback from people to this is that the online isn't the same thing. And I actually want to encourage the idea that in a lot of ways, especially for the neurodiverse community or people who just have autism or something else, this is a safe, encouraging space that they know online where they can get together as friends who may be around the world and they can play. And I'm again not saying this is necessarily what you're saying, but that it can actually be just as validating and just as encouraging. I know there's a lot of bad stuff that still happens online, but when you have a game master who knows what they're doing and can really help facilitate those peer relationships, for some people in the community that I work with, it's a breath of fresh air because they don't have to worry about COVID or disease or
Yeah.
their other health issues. But it's also a very different cerebral response to going up and meeting a bunch of people they don't know. Um, and I think the beauty of it is it's allowing them to believe and experience human relationship in a way that doesn't have the social anxiety as much.
Yeah, no, I'll caveat that. Like, I think that what you're talking about feels much different than, say, my younger son getting on Fortnite and just playing in a room with some random person, right? Like, that to me has a very different feel than if it's a group that gets together every Tuesday and plays and they get to know each other. And I would equate what you're saying there in your game rooms very similar to what I've told people in my life. Like, if you can't make an AA meeting, go find it because you can't drive or there's no public transportation or you just live so far away. Go find an AA meeting online because that's better than sitting by yourself. Like, there's still a community aspect at that point, right? Like, you show up, it's the same Zoom meeting, you get to know those people, like there is something that happens online, to your point, for people who maybe can't get out of their house due to physical limitations. So I 100% get that. And I'm not, I think it's two different things, right? Like, I'd rather see my kid in a room every day with the same 8 people making those connections. I have some friends that I've had for years that I met online back when message boards were a thing. So I know it can happen, but again, I think it's maybe we've tipped the scales too much to like an isolated online world, I guess. That's what the isolated anonymous online world is what worries me.
And I'm right there with you. I wasn't trying to call you out or
No, no, no.
anything.
I wanted to, because again, like I am the first person to go like, go to a Zoom meeting because I think it's great, right? Like, so I hear what you're saying, and I think that's a great point for people who maybe are a little scared to go out. They can make friends on these Zoom meetings or these Zoom games, or I don't even know how you host them, but I would imagine it feels like Zoom and or Teams or whatever. And that's a great way to get people together who maybe otherwise would stay at home alone, you know?
And as someone who has had extreme anxiety throughout his life, I will say I've had days where I've walked outside, and the first thing that has happened is I've had an intrusive thought as I look at the sky of what happens if a meteor hits you as
Mm,
you walk down the street. There's a lot of really complex things that can happen in the mind, and I can appreciate as well the mindset of I don't want to go outside right now.
yeah,
Doesn't feel safe.
I get it. I get it. So what you've created is a spot for people to then be able to at least enjoy life and find some, community in that way. So, good point. I like it. Um, so, I know that we are coming up on an hour, and I always try to be respectful of time. I Everything that we've talked about, I think is really interesting, and I think there's tidbits in here for everybody. Again, not our normal subject matter, but I do want to point out that towards the end, it really got to some of the pillars of like recovery for me. Are like one of my biggest pillars is like community, and I think that you're building a community through your games and through your advocacy, and it's something that I just keep harping on for everybody. It's like you need to find some sort of community and some sort of support network regardless of whatever's going on in your life. I think it's something that slips away from us in this country more and more. Like I just said, like, if you're just living in an isolated world, scrolling Instagram or scrolling TikTok, and it can feel like you have 1,000 friends, but really you might not have many, full blown connections. So the more that you can make, the better. And it seems like that's what you're trying to do, Thomas. So I love it. Um, the last thing I always like to talk about on the podcast is media. So I'm a big lover of music and movies and TV. Um, I don't get to read many books just based on my days right now. I'm more like a vacation book guy, but I always ask guests for some recommendations around TV or movies or, books, what's ever interesting you these days. So is there something out there that you're really loving right now?
So yeah, I definitely have a few things. One of my all-time favorite books that I've read was The Soloist. Well, I should say is The Soloist. If you haven't seen the movie with Robert Downey Jr. and I believe Jamie Foxx, it's a great movie as well. It is about a New York Times reporter who stumbles across an individual who is on the streets, who turns out had gone to Juilliard, um, and they develop a friendship and they build together their own little community of resiliency. And it's a beautiful representation of a lot of systems and things in place that impact mental health. The other thing that I would definitely also, well, the only thing I would say about that is there are some very serious subject matter in it. So if you're not looking to be triggered from time to time, it might be a little bit hard to read. Not as hard as some, but um, the other thing that I have definitely, I've talked about this creator for a long time. There is a podcast called Worlds Beyond Number. If you like D&D or if you want to listen to something that's purely audio that has to do with Dungeons and Dragons, it is a beautiful creation by Abria Irongar, Erica ICE. I'm not great with that last name. Lou Wilson and Brennan Lee Mulligan.
Hmm.
It is an actual play, which means they're playing D&D at the real time of recording in a theatrical sense. And it is based on Studio Ghibli and all of the animated films from there, and it's absolutely glorious. And luckily, they have a lot of free episodes right now, which is great as well. And Brennan Lee Mulligan and not Erica, Abria Irongar are two of my favorite game masters of all time. Again, there are some content warnings there, but I would highly recommend checking those out as well.
Okay. I like those too. I am going to give mine for this episode. So my two are TV shows, both on Netflix this week. One is, I listen to a couple podcasts kind of on the regular, and one of them is Armchair Expert. which is hosted by Dax Shepard, and he had on Bradley Cooper a couple weeks ago, and Bradley Cooper recommended a show, Love on the Spectrum. It's a show on Netflix, and it's like a dating show. Is the best way. It's like a dating documentary, maybe. I'm not even sure how to describe it. But folks who fall on the autism spectrum it shows them navigating the world of relationships. And my wife and I started to watch it. And when Bradley described it, it was very much in the vein of like, you were watching a very intense relationship happen very quickly. And I'm not an emotional person. I don't cry a lot. I don't, it takes a lot to get to me, but this show is so interesting to watch how the families are supporting these adults, because they are adults in most cases. So these families are supporting adults going out into the world and trying to find, a companion, and then the people are going on these dates, and it's just there's so many emotions happening at once. It's a lot, but a very touching show, and something that I've enjoyed watching, and watching it with my wife. We watch maybe an episode a night. Again, it's a lot to take in at once. So that's one. And then two, which is way more fun and whimsical, is Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's a comedy show. I think it was on Fox originally. Goofy comedy show, and has really made me much more lighthearted during the day. I find when I'm watching comedy from time to time, I tend to kind of take on the characters. So if anybody's looking for just a goofy comedy show to have on in the background, Brooklyn Nine-Nine is probably a good choice. So those are my two for the week. Thomas, anything that you want to leave the listeners with?
Definitely. I do want to say I'm actually rewatching the entire series of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's an amazing show. Really, really handles some very serious topics super well as well. But I would definitely say the last things I really want to reiterate, especially if you're someone within the communities that I've talked about, or you have someone in your life who is within those communities, there are two things I want to reiterate. One, you are not alone. It really may feel like it, but it doesn't mean you are. And the other thing is, one thing that I really like to also say is, if you're having a bad day, and someone's trying to tell you something and it just feels frustrating and upsetting, I want to remind you that it's not always your fault because you don't understand what someone says or how they process information. There are so many complexities, so many aspects of human communication that are so hard. So if you have those moments, please give yourself grace. Please honor yourself. And if you have the energy, go back to that conversation at another point. I myself am a very emotional individual. You might have been able to tell in this call, but that's something I try to always tell myself, because communication is always done best when you are best able to communicate.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Thomas. Again, really appreciate you being on. I'm going to link all of Thomas's, business information in the show notes. So please click on that. And we will be back here next week with another episode. If you could just subscribe, comment, anything you can do helps us gain listeners according to everything I hear. And just want to get more ears on the podcast, because, guests like Thomas are so valuable to just bettering our society. And that's really what I'm trying to do here. So again, thanks, Thomas, and we will talk to everybody next week.